Hey folks, welcome to this brief video summary of Eric Foner's Give Me Liberty 3rd edition, Chapter 19, Safe for Democracy, the United States and World War I, 1916 to 1920. There's going to be a lot going on in the United States during this time period and a lot going on outside of the United States. So let's get started. Please remember though, this is just a summary. You will get far more detail by actually reading the text and taking notes on it. So use this as a warm-up or as a review. Well, let's get started. So this time period of the early 1900s was an era of intervention for the United States, where the United States began to project its power beyond its own borders. One example, from 1901 to 1920, United States Marines were in Caribbean countries over 20 times, countries like the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Haiti. There was also a lot of intervention in Central America. For instance, Theodore Roosevelt, when he was president, oversaw the construction of the Panama Canal. There was a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes that was involved in this process. The United States asserted its role in Central America. And Roosevelt issued something that became known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Now, the Monroe Doctrine, issued all the way back in the 1820s, had basically told the European countries to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. Roosevelt added to this by asserting the United States' right to have police power over the countries in the Western Hemisphere. And that's what this cartoon here on the right is showing, with Theodore Roosevelt dressed up as a police officer swinging around his billy club that has the name The New Diplomacy, and people down here representing the different countries, both of Central America, South America, and the Western Hemisphere and Asia. Meanwhile, after Roosevelt, you had William Howard Taft become president, and he practiced something known as dollar diplomacy, trying to encourage American businesses to get involved in these countries and to strengthen their economies, but to the benefit of the United States economy. And he was followed by Woodrow Wilson, who we're going to hear a lot more about later with World War I. And Wilson was big on what he dubbed moral diplomacy or moral imperialism, which was that countries and their governments should do the right thing. And if they weren't doing the right thing, then the United States would put pressure on them to do the right thing, whether that be economic pressure or military pressure. And this was a time period that saw the United States intervening even in Mexico. Mexico was in the midst of a terrible civil war that began in 1911 and lasted for almost 2 decades. The United States troops were actually involved. They were in Veracruz, where some conflicts broke out, and they also pursued Pancho Villa, who was an actual person, if you weren't familiar. In 1916, U.S. troops actually crossed into Mexico to try and capture Pancho Villa, who had done some raids in the United States and killed some Americans in Mexico and in New Mexico. So this is going to lead up to the United States entering what was known as the Great War at the time, what we know today as World War I. And World War I broke out in the summer of 1914 in Europe, and this was the result, a culmination of European nationalism, imperialism, militarism, and secret alliances. The Allied powers were made up of Britain, France, Russia, and Japan, and they were squaring off against the Central Powers, which was Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. This quickly became a stalemate and led to things like trench warfare, where soldiers were dying by the thousands, hundreds of thousands, and eventually by the millions just for a few feet of land in France or Belgium. Ultimately, 10 million soldiers and millions more of civilians would die in this conflict. Meanwhile, while Europeans were killing themselves over in Europe and in southeastern Europe, in places like what is today Turkey, the United States was staying neutral. There were divisions, though, within our country, arguments between immigrants and their descendants over who the United States should support. There was also conflict over how the United States should be involved. If we weren't sending soldiers, we certainly were providing supplies. We were sending messages of neutrality, messages of peace, but at the same time, American companies were providing a lot of the ammunition and the food that was needed for combat. So Woodrow Wilson officially declared the United States neutral. However, this did not keep the United States out of the conflict, really. Many Americans died as a result of naval warfare because we'd be shipping supplies to countries in Europe, and submarines, mainly German submarines, would shoot down ships without necessarily checking to see if they were military ships or not. And the most well-known sinking took place in May of 1915 when a British ship known as the Lusitania was sunk. and 128 Americans died on this ship. The Americans were very angry about this, but nevertheless remained neutral. Eventually, though, the United States would enter World War I. Wilson was reelected in 1916 as president with the slogans of "He kept us out of war" and "Peace without victory." He wanted the war to end, but he didn't want one country to have bragging rights about winning and beating the other countries. Meanwhile, the German submarines, or as they were known in the U.S. as U-boats, as slang for the German word Unterboots, they sank several U.S. ships. And this angered Americans again, but not quite to the point of war. And then came the Zimmermann telegram, which this cartoon on the right is talking about. So the Zimmermann telegram was from Germany to Mexico, and Germany was basically asking Mexico to enter the war against the United States. It was intercepted by the British and shared with the United States. And with the release of this telegram and the Russian Revolution, that very same month overthrew the autocratic czar in Russia, the United States felt pressured to join the war, and they did on the side of the Allies, the side of Great Britain and France. So the United States joins, as President Woodrow Wilson said, to make the world safe for democracy. And Congress officially voted for war on April 6, 1917. And so with the United States entry, Woodrow Wilson issued what became known as the 14 points to make clear what the United States' aims were in entering the war. And we'll go over what these aims were in class. So with the United States entering the war, the United States pulled out all the stops to get the United States into the war and support the war and to shut down any dissent. So on the home front, progressives, which had seen a lot of change, they saw the entry of the war as a chance to reform America from the top to the bottom and to spread their progressive values worldwide. And this was widely supported by many intellectuals and reformers at the time. So what this meant, well, the government's powers were widely expanded to increase support for the war. The selective service, or the draft, was introduced for the first time since the Civil War, and 24 million men were required to register for it. The government got involved in regulating industry, agriculture, railroads, and even labor relations to try and produce everything the country needed for the war effort. And there's plenty of propaganda. A government organization known as the Committee on Public Information, sought to strengthen support through propaganda, like what we have here on the right, which basically portrays the Germans as giant gorillas and they're threatening mankind, well, in this case, womankind, in that art. And so they flooded the country with posters like this, with newspaper articles, with speeches. If you went to see a movie or a play, there were men who would stand up in the audience and give 4-minute speeches promoting the war effort and trying to encourage people to support the war. And they portrayed enemies as brutes and animals, dehumanizing them. Meanwhile, during World War I, women were very involved on the home front, but they also saw this as a time to push for women's suffrage, the right to vote. And this was even endorsed by Woodrow Wilson late in 1916. Jeanette Rankin at this time also became the first congresswoman. In fact, her first vote as a congresswoman was to vote against U.S. entry into World War I. Women were heavily involved in the war effort. They were nurses. They worked to raise money. The National Women's Party, though, on the home front, was using militant tactics to try and get the United States to support women's suffrage across the country. And one of the leaders of this was a woman named Alice Paul, who said, just asking for the right to vote would not work. So she led efforts to get the vote by picketing the White House, by having hunger strikes in prison when women were arrested for picketing the White House. And they would picket the White House with signs like this. Notice it says Kaiser Wilson. Kaiser was the title given to the leader of Germany at this time. And so using a title like that for Wilson was basically calling him a dictator, not a duly elected president. Eventually, this succeeded. The 19th Amendment, which granted the right to vote to all women, was ratified in 1920. This era also saw an increase in support for prohibition. There was a surge in support due to World War I, basically because of the United States promoting nativism against immigrants who drank things like beer, like the Germans in particular. And so the 18th Amendment was ratified in 1919, which prohibited the production, transportation, and use of alcohol in the United States, and this would last until 1933. Meanwhile, with the United States entering the war, there were a lot of questions about liberty and civil liberties, and a lot of those were repressed during wartime. There was widespread repression of civil liberties. There were laws passed like the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act that restricted speech and the press in criticizing the war effort and the government in the war. And these laws and these repression of civil liberties mostly affected socialists, groups like the International Workers of the World, or the Wobblies, and other laborers and foreign language publications. Eugene V. Debs, a leader of the Socialist Party, a leader who had been involved in many strikes, he actually was imprisoned for violating these laws. And even while he was in prison, he ran for president. Here's his campaign button while he was in president. So there were also people who were patriotic, but they used that patriotism for some coercive or negative ways. You had neighbors who attacked neighbors who they deemed unpatriotic. You also had a group called the American Protective League, which was a volunteer group organized by the Justice Department that would rat out or sometimes physically assault people who were deemed undemocratic or unsupportive of the war effort. Immigrants to the United States were also pressured to assimilate and become more quote unquote American. Foreign things were prohibited, food, language, and music. If it wasn't considered quote unquote American, it was prohibited or frowned upon. So there was this question of who is an American during this time period, even before the United States entered the war. There's something dubbed the race problem. Now, you might hear that and think, oh, we're talking about black and white issues, but it was actually far beyond that. And it was came from this fear of the white race losing power and losing numbers, an increase in fear of immigrants coming to the United States, and the race problem called for or demanded Americanization of immigrants. And it promoted this idea of the United States as the melting pot, where folks would come into the United States and kind of melt together and become one thing, whatever the definition of American was. And there was pressure on immigrants to Americanize their language, their clothes, their food, to give up their customs and languages that they came to the United States with. Germans in particular were targeted since the United States was fighting Germany in World War I. Immigration restrictions were enacted during this time period. In fact, the first literacy tests for immigrants were passed. Even though President Woodrow Wilson vetoed it, Congress overrode his veto. This was also a time period that saw more attention being paid to the idea of eugenics, which argued that states should be able to restrict the reproduction of certain people. And not surprisingly, a lot of people who were targeted by eugenics laws were minority races, or they were immigrants, or they were poor. And these laws were actually upheld by the Supreme Court. Latinos and Asian Americans were actually viewed separately from a lot of other immigrants, though. Even those Latinos who were American, Puerto Ricans, for instance, finally were able to get American citizenship as a territory. However, they were still looked down upon and never really considered American during this time period. African Americans, meanwhile, had a very unique experience during World War I. This was an idea that was dubbed the color line. During the Progressive era, when all these reforms were taking place, African Americans really didn't see many benefits from a lot of these progressive movements and reforms. They were left out, oftentimes intentionally. Segregation, in fact, was seen as natural by even many progressive leaders. And African Americans also saw little to no support from the presidents of the United States, like Roosevelt and Taft and Wilson. Wilson, in particular, when he became president, allowed for some regressive policies. So even African Americans had seen some growth of power and influence in the federal government. They quickly saw that disappear once Wilson became president. However, this inspired African Americans to engage in protest. And this was led in large part by folks like W.B. Du Bois, who was a professor, or he was a professor and the first African American to receive his PhD from Harvard University. Very influential. He resisted what were considered accommodationist ideas of Booker T. Washington. and wanted and called for greater protests for African Americans to have political, civil, and economic rights and not have to wait for it. Du Bois and others helped form the Niagara Movement and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which you may have heard of now as the NAACP. And he actually supported U.S. entry into World War I and saw it as an opportunity for blacks to show unity with all Americans, that they believed in the things that the United States was fighting for, and that once the war was over and African Americans came back, that their bravery in the war would show that they truly did deserve the same rights and the same power. Um, However, the results were far less than what was hoped. We'll actually talk about that in class. Um, at the same time, at home, there was something known as the Great Migration taking place. So, because of the war and the need for supplies, and a lot of workers, particularly white men, being drafted and serving in the military, there was a demand for laborers in northern factories. And from 1910 to 1920, over 500,000 blacks left the South for the North, a great migration from southern states to the North. Why did they do this? Well, they saw a chance for higher wages, a chance for more educational opportunities, and they had a desire for more rights than they believed they were getting in the South. And for many of them, they did see higher pay. They saw better education. They had safer neighborhoods. However, there was conflict, a lot of racial conflict when they moved into these cities, even in northern cities. There were several race riots. Racism and economic competition led to violence. There was lynching. There were riots in the North and South. Hundreds of these riots took place, and lynchings in the thousands over a span of about 70 years. There also emerged the idea of Garveyism. These were based on the ideas of Marcus Garvey and his organization called the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA. Marcus Garvey, who was himself an immigrant, he supported national self-determination, just like other groups in Europe at the end of World War I were having the right of self-determination. He wanted that for African Americans. And the same recognition was not forthcoming. Garvey himself was deported, but he galvanized. He helped create a lot of energy and excitement in this idea about Black unity and this push for rights. So 1919 is one of those years that saw a lot of drastic changes around the world. Worldwide upheaval, drastic political and social change. The USSR, Communist Russia, was established, and this led to communist uprisings all over Europe. This, in the United States, led to something known as the Red Scare, these rumors and fear of the United States being taken over by a communist revolution. And one response by the government was dubbed the Palmer Raids, where people who were suspicious, socialists, communists, were basically their homes and offices were raided by the federal government. Some of them were even deported, even though some of them were U.S. citizens at the time. The summer of 1919 was called Red Summer because of the dozens of race riots that left thousands dead, and there would be more race riots and racial troubles that would come in the years to follow. African Americans who had served in the military in World War I came back to the United States. Several were lynched from wearing the uniforms. The ones who had fought bravely and earned medals were still oftentimes forgotten and mistreated by their own country. But at the same time, in some cities like Chicago and Washington, D.C., they used their military training to fight back when white communities would attack and threaten their own communities. There was also a flu epidemic that killed 20 to 40 million people all around the world. It's dubbed the Spanish flu because that was the first country that officially reported it, even though the flu likely began in the United States and quickly spread because of the soldiers traveling around the world. There's also a lot of labor unrest. 4 million workers went on strike in 1919 alone. The unions, though, were nearly crushed in the government response and the use of government force against it. Meanwhile, over in Europe, in Paris, the world leaders were hashing out the Treaty of Versailles, and Versailles is a palace in France just outside of Paris. World War I had ended with an Allied victory, and Woodrow Wilson had hoped to enact what had been dubbed the 14 points, to have a peace without victory. However, the other allies wanted to punish Germany, and eventually they got their way. It was a very lopsided treaty that planted the seeds for World War II. We'll go into detail as to how. However, when Wilson came back to the United States, and tried to convince the Senate to ratify the treaty, the Senate refused to ratify it. In fact, this cartoon on the right is a comedic version where Uncle Sam is going to marry a version of the Treaty of Versailles, these foreign entanglements, and the US Senate is bravely breaking through the window to stop the wedding from happening. Um, Wilson fails to get the treaty ratified, and he eventually has a stroke and is basically ineffective his last year in office. The United States is going to return to isolationist policies, to social and economic and political conservatism for the 1920s, and stay out of world events as the world is going to begin to stumble towards the Great Depression and then into World War II. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching, and hope to see you back here for chapter 20, where we get into the Roaring Twenties.